Hello, and welcome to another episode of Law in Sarasota. I'm your host, Adam Tabrouge. The goal of the Sarasota County school system is to ensure that all students receive a high-quality education. But sometimes students suffer from disabilities and need special accommodations. To discuss the law and your rights in this area, I have with me today attorney Jane Windsor. Jane, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Jane, you have an interesting background, I think, that really makes you qualified to practice in the field of education law. Tell us a little bit about your personal history.
All righty. I'm a little bit of a late bloomer. I went to law school at the tender age of 48 after being an elementary school teacher in Tampa in both public and private school. I taught second and third grade. And during that time, I observed a lot of students that had difficulty learning in the classroom. I would open up something called an IEP, an individual education plan, where we would do some prescriptive teaching to help some of these students achieve academic success. And I had a lot of success with that. At the age of 48, I had kicked around going to law school for about 20 years, had a very low LSAT score, law school admission test score, didn't know why. But went ahead and went to law school anyway, feeling like I was getting pretty old and I better do it now. I actually went up to Thomas Cooley in Michigan. And during that time, I discovered that I myself have dyslexia. And I had to have accommodations, and I had to learn the American with Disabilities Act and some areas of the law so that I could advocate for myself. And interestingly enough, those laws very much paralleled the laws that are used in elementary school for advocating for children. When I got out of law school and started practicing, I opened up somewhat of a general practice, did some family law, estate planning, and education law, and found that there was just no one that really understood the classroom problems and the advocacy issues for these students. And the most important component, I think, is the psychological educational testing to see what is actually going on with this child's learning and to guide the parents in getting them the services that they need, both in school as well as out of school. So that's how I ended up in it.
So Jane, you have an office here in Sarasota, and when parents come to you, what type of services do you offer? How do you get started in working on cases like this?
Well, the first step is we schedule an initial consultation. I do those at a very low hourly rate. In fact, I probably put about 3 or 4 hours into that for 2 hours of sitting down with them and helping them figure out how we might solve this problem. If they decide to retain me, that nominal amount of money is actually applicable to retaining me. And I actually have 4 programs after that where I will guide the parent through first the testing phase. I do that. I don't know if you're interested in the cost that I charge, but it's a fairly nominal amount. In getting some testing done for this student, I guide them to the professionals. They choose the professionals, but I'll give them a number of names. They can check with their insurance. Sometimes the schools will do the testing, and I always make them aware of that option to find out what's going on from a processing standpoint. And then from there, I have a second program where I will stay with the student for a year. I'll attend every IEP, Individual Education Plan, 504 meeting, manifestation meeting, whatever they need me to do during that year to get a proper match of services with the child's needs. And I go into those meetings with a very positive stance. I'm not there to fight the schools. I think most of the time the schools are glad I'm there. I show the parents how to articulate what they want for their child and how to work together as a team to get that done. I also offer hourly representation if they need it. Due process is available, but that I always recommend as a very last resort if nothing else works.
Jane, how is it that a parent might come to the conclusion that they need the services of somebody like yourself? Is it because their child is having issues in the school system, or what are some of the signs for a parent to be on the lookout for?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. In fact, if you go to my website, I have about 15 or 20 signs to look for. I'll mention a couple: getting in trouble in school, hating school, difficulty reading, difficulty with math, difficulty with writing. It can, each of these children, and I think the number that I'd heard was 11 to 20% of our student population has some sort of a learning issue. So there are a lot of signs that are very different for each child. And I would say to a parent, you know your child, if something feels wrong, get it tested to see what might be going on with that child.
Now, you've mentioned testing on a couple of occasions here. What is this testing designed to reveal?
It reveals a number of things, and there are a number of ways that you can go at it. The DSM-5 kind of changed a lot of the testing a year ago. But generally what you do is you have an IQ test, you have a Woodcock-Johnson, you have a whole bunch of different batteries performed on this child to get to their underlying abilities and their disabilities. And very often what you'll find with a child who's very bright is they may show an IQ of 100 or less, but they have a disability that's causing that. And they may actually be a lot brighter than the parents know that they are or the school knows that they are. Sometimes it used to be that they used something called discrepancy testing. That's fallen out of favor, where they would say there had to be a difference between a high IQ and a very low performance in school. But that was really not adequate in terms of being able to figure out what's going on with a child. It can be anywhere on that spectrum.
Jane, we've used the term disability on a couple of occasions here. What are we referring to? What type of disabilities do you see in your practice?
I see everything. It could be a child with autism. I have a lot of children with autism. It could be a child with ADD. It could be a child with an auditory processing problem. It could be a child with a visual processing problem like I have. It could be a child with some emotional disabilities who may be very bright but getting into trouble all the time at school. And my belief is until you get the behavior under control, learning's not really going to take place. We have to get to the bottom of what's causing that. There are any number of things that could be at the root of it. And that's why I'm not a doctor, I'm a lawyer, but boy do I know some great people that can do that testing and prove that there really is something going on with that child.
And do you work primarily with the students or primarily with the parents or primarily with the school system? Talk a little bit about that.
I kind of look at my job as one of being able to bring all three of those together. I don't think I can be very effective with a child if I don't have rapport with that child. So I spend time in the first meeting really building rapport with that student. I let them know that I've got problems that are probably as serious as any of theirs, and I encourage them that I have faith that they can do it. I'm going to show them some new ways that maybe they haven't tried before, and that I feel like they can be successful. I think that's the most important first message to a student, that you believe in them. And then I get them to do some of the testing. Most of these kids have been tested before, they're sick of it, so I have to kind of build their trust enough to give it one more try. And then I have the parents come back without the child, and we do a consult with a PhD in special ed who's worked in this area for about 35 years. And we look at the students' records from school, behavior records, the performance records, grades, standardized testing, and some of this psychoeducational testing, and we can figure out pretty quickly what has gone on and go from there.
Well, I tell you what, Jane, we're going to continue our conversation here in just a moment, so please stay tuned for some more Law in Sarasota.
Seven 7,000 high school students drop out every school day. That's a line of desks more than 4 miles long. We can keep students in school. Visit boostup.org and take the first step.
Welcome back to Law in Sarasota. Today, my guest is Jane Windsor, and Jane practices in the area of special education law. Jane, You were talking a little bit about your practice when we went to break. Could you give us a little background and a little history of the development of special education laws in our country?
Sure. It's interesting because this area of the law, I think, is one of the most emerging at this time. But for those of us that are in our 40s or 50s or 60s, this was really largely an untapped area as we were growing up. Most of the developments in special education law didn't really start until the 70s. Probably one of the most important cases is Brown versus the School Board, which is one that we're mostly familiar with. I think it was from the 50s, that laid the foundation for some of the children's rights regarding education, not having a separate but equal education, but actually being not being discriminated against if there's something different. And with that came, I guess, two cases in the 70s, Park and Mills. If you're interested, you can go to my website and look that up. And then from that really emerged a lot of the public laws that gave us our current Individual with Disabilities Education Act today, 504 legislation. ADA also developed, I guess, during the 90s at about the same time. We don't use ADA that much in
and what is ADA?
American with Disabilities Act. We don't really use that law that much except in colleges. We typically used the IDEA for elementary school and high school.
All right, let's start with that for the moment. IDEA, what does that stand for?
It's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it came from public law, and I can't remember the numbers after that, but I have that on my website. It actually provides the rights to a free and appropriate public education, which is what we cite when we are looking to get these rights for these students. We also go into the Code of Federal Regulations a little bit. Those are federal laws that allow these students with learning disabilities to be educated with students that don't have learning disabilities, that simply need some specialized teaching to reach their potential in the classroom, and sometimes accommodations at testing time to prove that they know the material when they actually do.
Could you give us some example of what you mean by both rights and accommodations?
Absolutely. Very often, if a student does not qualify under the IDEA, they may qualify under Section 504. And those are two somewhat separate and distinct sets of laws that I have to look at and say, does this student have enough going on with them that I can get them lots of services over here, or do they really not need that many services, but they may just need an accommodation at testing time? I tend to think of the IDEA in terms of more of the specialized teaching and the services in the classroom during the whole day, or they may be pulled out for services, as opposed to 504, where you may have a student that needs something special, like a private testing room. They can learn in a classroom, or they may even have a health problem where they have to go up and get a shot during the day, something that's outside their teaching, but it may have something to do with their being able to perform well and prove that they know the material. They overlap somewhat, but they don't always, if that makes sense.
Well, you've mentioned special services. Could you give us some examples of those type of services?
Absolutely. It may be speech and language help. It may be pulled out reading or math help. Some students are wonderful and do great in a reading center or in a reading class along with the rest of their classmates, but yet they've got a math processing issue and they need to be pulled out for special services there. You have other students that they are a year or two behind in reading, but they're off the charts on math. Each one of these students is different. It's not a one-size-fits-all Band-Aid, and that's why you have to have the psychoeducational testing to really see where the problems are with that particular student.
And you've used the word accommodations a couple of times and maybe given an example or two, but could you discuss that a little bit further of what we mean by that?
I can. I had a young lady in my second grade classroom that had Erb's palsy. She was brilliant, but she could not sit down and do her Florida Writes and write. She had to have somebody else help her write. In this case, she needed extra time. That was an accommodation so that she could either use her hand that she wrote with and take extra time to prove that she knew the material, or she would have somebody else write for her. That would be a good example of an accommodation.
Now, is our school system set up to acknowledge people's rights, provide these services, or provide these accommodations?
That's a great question. I think they do the best they can. They have unlimited need and limited resources, like every business or every government entity that exists out there. And sometimes parents will go in and they'll fight for services and they'll get them, and they may not need that service for that child. And that service could go for someone else. So what I really try to get is a good matchup. I want to take what they need, that they're entitled to, but not more than they need, and make sure that what this student's getting is actually going to help them. Does that answer your question?
Well, talk about that a little bit further. For instance, in the first instance, wouldn't it be up to the schools to identify the students who need these services and accommodations?
Sometimes, and sometimes parents will fight that, and sometimes with good reason and sometimes without good reason. Sometimes there's almost a grieving process in accepting the fact that you've got a child that has something that's not perfect. And I've had parents, when they look at the reports, sit there and sob and think, oh my gosh, my child has this terrible problem and they're never going to do well. To me, I think that's the light bulb goes off, and that's the starting point of being able to put a plan in place that's going to help this child to succeed. That's not the time to cry. That's the time to rejoice that we finally understand why this child is having problems. Schools actually very often are the ones to initiate that process. They'll want to do the testing. They'll spend thousands of dollars to do the testing, and the parent will fight it. And they'll call me and say, I don't want my child tested. And I'll say, okay, they can take you to due process. And get that testing done. I would recommend that we go ahead and pick out the testing person that you want and have the testing done and then provide it to the school, and they either adopt it or they don't.
Jane, I think one thing that's important is that when you're using the word testing, it sounds to me like it's more for diagnostic purposes for the students that you're working with.
It is not only diagnostic for diagnostic purposes, but it's also for a therapeutic, what are we going to do to fix the problem? You have to understand the problem first. And if you don't have the testing done, you cannot make a claim for services. You can't start to fix it if you don't know what's wrong. Sometimes the problem is as simple as the child needs glasses, and he's not doing well in school because he can't see, or the child has an auditory processing problem, they can't hear, and they're acting up because they can't do the material because they're not hearing. It's not always that complicated.
Well, Jane, we're going to take another break, and then when we come back, we'll continue our discussion about special education needs. And please stay tuned for some more Law and Sarasota.
My life is full of statistics. Thing is, I could have dropped out of school and become one myself, but I didn't, because I had people that believed in me. Here's another statistic. 7,000 students drop out every school day. That's one every 26 seconds. It's time that students know that we believe in them.
Inspire a student and share your message of support at boostup.org.
Welcome back to Law and Sarasota. I'm your host, Adam Tabrouge. And today my guest is Jane Windsor, and we're discussing special education law in the state of Florida. Jane, we've been talking about some of the services that are available to students that you work with. And one type of service is something that you've called an IEP.
Right.
What is an IEP?
An IEP is an individualized education program, and I think of it as a prescription and treatment plan for a child who's struggling in school. If I were going to look at it, I almost look at it, you go into a doctor, you've got something wrong with you, you've got to first of all figure out what's wrong with you, and then you have to come up with a plan to get better. And that's kind of what an IEP is. You have a team that cares about this student. I tell parents you're best not to attend this meeting alone, and you're best to really prepare for this meeting. It's not something you go in and wing. There are a team of people that are concerned with the educational welfare of this child, and it's very important to have every member of that team there.
So let's talk about the team for a second. What type of people would make up the team?
Okay, depending on the age and the nature of the child, sometimes the child attends, and sometimes it's not appropriate for the child to attend, but it's basically the child's parents should be there. At least one of the child's regular education teachers should be there. At least one of the child's special education teachers or service providers should be there. A school district representative who's qualified to provide or supervise the special education instruction, and as well as knowledgeable about the general education curriculum and the district resources. So that person is very important. An individual who can interpret the instructional implications and evaluation results that the school's either done or that they have been done independently. And anyone else that has knowledge or expertise about that child. And I very often attend those meetings. When I do, the school district will send their attorney as well.
Now, IEPs, Individualized Education Programs, is this something that happens throughout the school years, that is from elementary school all the way through high school?
It can. Sometimes the school will be the one to initiate this, and sometimes the parents are the ones to initiate it. I recommend no less than 1 year, and sometimes there's no limit on the number of times that you can meet. If the child is undergoing some problems, you want to meet more often than that.
So, Jane, could you give us some examples of some of the things that might be included in an individualized education program?
Depending on the student, you would discuss perhaps the testing that was recently done, what that revealed, what that means that the child may need. You usually have a present level of performance, they call that a plop, where you understand where that child is right now, and then you set goals and benchmarks, and you have a plan to get there. It's a wonderful opportunity to really participate in your child's education and in solving whatever problem that they're having in school.
So as the attorney working with these parents and students, what role do you play in these team meetings and in the formation of the individualized education?
There are 3 roles that I play. The most important one that I play is making sure that we have an accurate diagnosis of what's going on with that child before we get in there and we start tinkering with their education. But I try to get the parents looking at this as an opportunity to be a very positive advocate for their child. I tell them the things that they need to do during this meeting and the things that they have to stay away from. Obviously, I don't want them in there screaming and hollering and blaming and criticizing.
Tell us some of the advice that you might...
Well, I've removed parents from meetings. I've gotten one up and said, please come with me. You're not going to be in here. You're not going to discuss. You're not going to talk to these people this way. I really insist that they protect the parent-school relationship, that they are looking for win-win solutions to problems, that they don't blame, that they don't criticize. They need to understand the school's position. And I will make them put together a plan, very much like you did as an attorney with a mediation plan. You talk about, here's the problem, here are the things that we want to accomplish, here are the things that if I don't get those things accomplished, it's not the end of the world. I'm not going to fight over those. These are the things that are the most important.
Jane, earlier in the program you made reference to due process hearing. Under what circumstances might that be applicable?
Well, a due process hearing is very much like a court, but it's a specialized kind of court that you work with in an educational setting. If something happens to your child in school, the general remedy is not to sue the school. Schools don't have money to pay out on huge lawsuits. When you go into these courts, the goal is to fix a problem, not to pay out a remedy. There are some remedies that are paid out. For instance, they may pay for public or private education for a student that has been failed substantially in a public school setting when the school system had a chance to fix it and they didn't. But that's rare. But usually a due process hearing is where you go when there's a problem and all else has failed. And you go before an administrative law judge that's actually kind of a member of the school district to look for a way to solve the problem.
And you've used the term a few times that that's rare, that your cases would go to that stage.
It is rare. I don't believe that that's the best place to ever start. I think the better place to start is to understand what's going on with the child and try to get them the proper services so you can avoid due process and you can focus on their educational needs.
And have you found the school district to be willing to work with you to achieve these goals?
90% of the time, yes. And when they aren't, it's really a matter of educating each other on what's going on.
So Jane, if there are parents out there who have been watching the program who have students that they think might meet some of these definitions that we've talked about, what might be a good first step for them to think about?
Well, I would say it won't cost you anything to go to my website. There's a lot of free information on there. Poke around there and see if anything is helpful. If they feel like it would be of value, call my office and we could schedule an initial consultation and talk about their student and what we might be able to do to help them. And then from there, they would either decide that this was something they wanted to do, or they'll know other options as well that might work for them.
And what's your overall assessment of how these laws are working to ensure that students receive a high quality individualized education?
10 or 15 years ago, I would tell you they weren't. I think we've come a really long way. And I think if you are well informed and you advocate well for your child, I think these laws can do a very good job to ensure their rights.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for coming on the program today to discuss this very interesting area of the law.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching another episode of Law in Sarasota.